Hello, and welcome to my live stream, where the concept is that I composed yesterday a short and simple epic tune that I called Dark Souls, and I guess it's quite easy to guess that where the title came from, because I was listening quite a lot to this game soundtrack of this game Dark Souls 3, which is the latest episode in this dark and sinister fantasy game series, which has proved to be quite popular. And well, the soundtrack in the game is quite excellent, and I guess we could start by listening a bit to one of the tunes from that soundtrack called Soul of Cinder, and the composer for this original soundtrack is Japanese composer Yuka Kitamura. So Soul of Cinder is sort of like this. So yeah, Soul of Cinder is, well, quite epic, quite dark. It has lots of tension going on, and if you think that what are the elements that we're finding there, there's like choir and of course the traditional cinematic orchestral layers and percussions, and so especially this part here. Here that there's like quite traditional and classical things going on, but they have been tweaked in a way to sound a bit more sinister and dark and epic, but they are not like that modern or sort of like hybrid. They are pretty close to what you'd hear from any classical composer, I guess. So I personally found this to be quite inspiring, because you rarely hear this kind of classic like sound in modern movies and in modern games, because usually the soundtracks are quite well, something else. They are usually quite modern and well, if you think that what kind of soundtracks, for example, Hans Zimmer makes, or what kind of soundtracks usual RPGs contain, they tend to have like quite tight and narrow field from where they pick the elements and to what kind of angle they approach the whole composing thing. So I think that this Dark Souls 3 especially was really a refreshing example of a game soundtrack that is in a way a bit different. So anyways, I got the idea that I wanted to try and create something that's sort of like Dark Soulish, I guess, and I hadn't really done anything like this before. I usually, when I do some epic stuff, I usually either go like quite traditional epic, like Hans Zimmer, or I go like quite minimalistic, like retro 90s kind of sound, Nobuo Uematsu or that kind of thing. So this was sort of like a new territory for me, I guess. So it was sort of interesting to try and see that can I manage to do something like this, and will it be a total failure, or will the end outcome be something that actually works. So the process was something quite similar than I usually do when I start composing. I sort of like opened Cubase and tried to think that what are the main tools that I will be using for this kind of stuff. And I tend to be quite improvisational composer. I usually just like to push the rec button and pick an instrument and then just like lay down the structures by playing them on my keyboards, and then I push stop, and usually that's the thing that I'm going to work on, and I rarely spend time on like re-recording stuff or deleting the stuff and making them from the scratch again. I usually use what I get from the first recording session, and then I move on to the next layers. So usually just in an hour or so I tend to get like the whole tune somewhat complete, because I rarely spend any time in just like reworking stuff. So it's quite efficient, I guess, because I usually just like record on the fly, then just tweak something if there is anything to tweak, and then go on. So for me, that's like always been the way I like to work, because I guess I'm sort of like an anxious person in a way that I just don't want to spend time doing anything else but creating new music. And of course, if you listen to the outcome, there are probably lots of details that some people would like to like tweak and hone and change and stuff, but for me it's more like I enjoy more to get a complete tune, even if it's not 100% perfect in like a short moment of time, instead of spending days and weeks on one tune and maybe get it a bit better than the first thing that I had like after an hour. So it's just something that for me personally is not that enjoyable. I like to just like dish out stuff very improvisationally, and if it's good enough, it's good enough, and then I move on and compose something else. So anyways, I tried to listen to that tune and sort of like figure out that what would be the reasonable tools that I would be using for creating something like this. And let's see if this is a bit hard to see that where the screen share sort of like cuts off, so I try to see that if I can show. Okay, yeah. So what I had initially was that I knew that I'm going to use some Contact, Native Instruments Contact stuff, and I'm a big fan of East West Quantum Leap, and so I have their Play. So the first contact that I loaded, I filled with cinematic strings, and I just loaded everything like first and second violins and violas and cellos and bass, and I realized that I especially want to use the sort of like typical epic marcato, staccato, run mode kind of things, and not that much like long background notes. So I basically loaded everything to run mode and marcatos and staccatos, and that's like the first contact that I will be using. And then the play, there I basically loaded just like Hollywood brass, trombones and French horns, and some woodwinds as well. I tried here to like duplicate some stuff so that the same thing that's being played with trombones and French horns are played with some of the woodwinds, maybe octave higher or something, and try to see how it feels, if it's like reasonable thing. And then I had another contact. I usually enjoy to do like copies of contact and then just load certain things in one instance instead of loading everything to one contact, because it's, for me, it's easier to sort of like stay in touch that what's the role of which contact like copy, and if I want to tweak or EQ, it's more reasonable for me to just like EQ the whole contact output instead of like routing stuff. So for me the routing thing is basically the contacts itself, so it makes it a bit more simple for me to handle the stuff. So the second contact copy was mainly for choirs, and I have quite a bit of 8DO stuff. I tend to like their instruments. For me they are quite intuitive to use, and I enjoy playing them because usually when I just like ramble around with my keyboards, the 8DO libraries tend to sound sort of like what I expect them to sound. So for me that's like the main thing with any virtual instruments, that if the intuition is off, then it's really something that I don't like enjoy playing, because I don't want to spend time trying to find out how the instrument works. If it doesn't really like fit my playing, then I move on and find next instrument instead of spending like time to learn how to play this instrument if it doesn't feel right. So 8DO usually manages to do that, and I've purchased quite a bit of their stuff, so I finally got also their like massive Titan and Destiny choirs, or whatever their names were, and yeah, they're quite epic. It's like really epic choir with some like phrases and stuff, and I basically loaded like two versions of the same choir and just put them to use the same phrasing, so that they play the same thing. And yeah, then I'm not sure if I actually, yeah, then I have another play instance where I have only percussions, and there I have a storm drum, Middle Earth ensemble, and then basic orchestral platinum timpani hits and steel plates, and so quite simple and nothing too much. And maybe I can sort of like just play that what are now the things that I have here. I was so lazy that I didn't even rename the channels, so it's quite hard to see that what I actually have in which, but I try to find a balance here that you can actually hear me speaking and at the same time hear something from these playing as well, but let's see if I can find a reasonable level. Okay. So the first channels were the cinematic strings. So there's like violins, violas, and cellos and bass. So I like cinematic strings. They have like a really intuitive way to, like, when I play something I get what I expect to get, so it's quite good, the intuition wise. And and that was like my baseline for the tune. So if I only play these, you can hear what's the role for only cinematic strings and nothing else. Let's see. Anyway, so if you hear only the cinematic string stuff, it's quite straightforward, quite simple, nothing that drastic. So I sort of like approach this with quite traditional way of like letting the cellies and bass do like that background rhythmic stuff and minor harmonic things, but mainly just like one note. And then I had the violins and violas and second violins do sort of like similar stuff together, but with violas being octave lower and then some harmony going on, so that when others are moving down, something are moving up. Yes, and there you already heard the tune partially with everything going on. So now you start to hear that even though the cinematic strings on their own sounded quite like bland, I guess, when we start to build the brass and the choirs on top of it and the percussion, then we start to like hear how all of those elements start to work together, and then the original quite bland sounding strings parts are like just one part on that whole thing, and then they start to work better than previously when we only heard them. So if we check out the brass and the woodwinds at this point only, their role is to emphasize the basic structures that the strings were doing. And I like to do these quite traditional like brass rises and sort of like tension creating like blasts that go like vroom. And then I wanted to create this like a sort of like build-up that when the tune progresses, it sort of like revolves around the same concepts, but they like build up and gain more like power and oomph without changing too much. So everything that was previously is still there, but there are like more layers, more instruments, more stuff. And so after the first brass, I just like to just add small harmonic details and more instruments layers without going over the top. And at this point I also wanted to include the choirs for the first time, and same thing there, first only partially and then with full stack. And now both. Yes, and then the final instrumentation was the percussion. So there was this Middle Earth ensemble from Stormdrum 2, and then timpanis and whatever they are called, steel plates. Yeah, so basically I usually approach this kind of epic percussion stuff quite simplistically. So I usually first lay down the basic beats with some drums that are like oomph enough. So for example, that Middle Earth ensemble is really fun. So it's like really intuitive to just like lay down the groove, and you can hear that it's already like really epic. So yeah, and when I've done that, I usually like to double it. In this case I doubled it with timpanis, and because timpanis are like toned, it makes sense to use the tone to your effect. So I check out that what's my main note for like strings, and then I use the timpanis to emphasize the harmony, what's going on. So and I usually use like octaves for timpanis as well, so that you get like more of the same. So and the steel plates are like really cool, like especially for this kind of like fantasy RPG, sinister, medieval, dark stuff, because it brings that sense of battle and metal clanging together. So even though it's not really like a sword strike, it still creates that feeling that okay, we're yeah, So for me it works. It sort of like makes it sound more cool and more medieval, and emphasizes those like tension building strikes and so on. So yeah, basically now we have all the different elements and layers that build up the whole tune. So if we just like go through them once again, it was first the cinematic strings, and then the Hollywood brass, and then the Hollywood woodwinds, and then the 8DO choir, and then those percussion stuff. And that's it. So basically, if I think at this point that what's the main difference between the original Dark Souls 3 tune that we listened in the beginning and this one of mine, I think the main difference is that I went quite a bit more minimalistic in this template of mine. So, for example, I don't have at this point any cymbals, and I don't have any long notes in the strings, and so on. So the layer structure of my tune is quite narrow. I only have like well, not that many channels, and the instrumentation is quite tight. And so I guess that if I really wanted to bring this tune up a notch in an epic way, I just have to like well, maybe add like 6 or 7 more channels and instruments, and build even more harmonic and doubling stuff. So at the point it's still like quite narrow, and it doesn't really sound that full. But then again, every new channel and every new instrument also requires more mixing and tweaking to prevent it sounding from like too thick and too like flooded. So for me it's also a matter of finding that balance, that what's enough and when less is more. And in this case I think that the current outcome is pretty okay. It doesn't really sound too much, but it doesn't really sound either like too little. So for me at least it sounds like okay, I leave it like this. And let's hear the tune with everything. So yeah, that's like one example of epic dark stuff and how I go about it. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope that it offered some pointers and material that you could maybe use yourself or learned something. I'm definitely not a professional myself, and I really don't know much about orchestration or like mixing and mastering or anything. So I just like to try things out and just like follow my own ears and intuition, and I'm still quite far from 2 steps from hell or that kind of stuff, so a long way ahead of me, but I'm still happy that it has already brought me this far, because if I compare this sound to, for example, something that I produced 5 years ago, it's really different, and of course the tools I have currently are way better than the tools I had then, so I think that overall composing stuff is mainly about the tools, and then learning how to use them efficiently, and then of course the actual composition work itself. So is the musical ideas behind all this good or not? But yeah. Anyways, let's see if I can record something different next time. See ya.